Right now, while you're watching this video, whatever browser is running on your computer already knows what time you woke up. It knows what you searched before breakfast. It knows what you've been quietly thinking about buying, which headlines made you angry enough to click, and what you were watching at 2 in the morning when you assumed nobody was paying attention. And here's the part that should actually bother you. You agreed to all of it, you just never read the part where you agreed. Most people treat browsing like it's private by default. You open a tab, you search something, you close it, and in your mind, it's just gone. That assumption is one of the most persistent myths in modern tech, because underneath every click, every scroll, every idle pause on a page, there's an entire invisible economy running quietly in the background, collecting, packaging, and trading data about you in real time, using the exact software you trust to get you online in the first place. Let's start with the browser. Most of you reading this are almost certainly using Chrome. Currently sits somewhere around 2/3 of global browser traffic, depending on which tracker you check. StatCounter puts it in the E. Mid to high 60s as of mid-2026. And it's been Google's default on-ramp to the internet for well over a decade. But here's the fact that gets buried under the convenience. Google is not, at its core, a technology company. It's an advertising company. Roughly 3/4 of Google's total revenue still comes directly from advertising, which means the more Google knows about your habits, your fears, your routines, and your desires, the more money it makes. That's not an accusation. That's their own publicly reported business model. And Chrome isn't just a browser inside that model. It's Google's single most powerful data collection instrument on the planet. Every site you visit gets logged. Every search gets stored. Every YouTube video, every shopping page, every symptom you Googled at midnight, all of it feeds a profile Google continuously builds and refines on you specifically. That profile doesn't just sit in a database somewhere. It's actively deployed to target you with ads across every device, every app, and every platform tied into Google's ecosystem, which, because Google also owns YouTube, Gmail, Maps, Docs, and Android, is genuinely hard to escape if Chrome is your front door to the internet. Now maybe you already made the switch that a lot of people think solves this. You moved to Microsoft Edge. Because it looks clean, it feels fast, and Microsoft has marketed it fairly heavily as the safer default alternative to Chrome. Here's what that marketing conveniently leaves out. Edge sends browsing data back to Microsoft's own servers by default, and independent researchers have documented that this isn't limited to basic diagnostic telemetry. It's included hardware identifiers, unique codes tied to your specific device, alongside full URLs of pages visited, in some cases, even inside in private mode, the exact feature Microsoft markets specifically as private browsing. The word private is doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting in that sentence, and multiple independent audits have found it doesn't hold up under scrutiny. There's a related concept worth understanding here because it's the part most people have genuinely never heard of, even though it affects them constantly. Browser fingerprinting. Even with cookies fully blocked, even without ever logging into a single account, websites can still identify you individually using your browser fingerprint. A combination. Made up of your screen resolution, your installed fonts, your system language, your time zone, your browser version, and dozens of other small technical signals. Combine enough of those signals, and researchers have found the resulting profile can identify an individual user with well over 99% accuracy. Chrome and Edge both leave this door wide open by default, and neither one seriously fights it. Because meaningfully fighting fingerprinting would mean fighting against the exact advertising infrastructure that funds the companies behind them. But here's where this story actually changes, and it's the reason I'm making this video now, in the middle of 2026, instead of at any earlier point. There's one browser left among the mainstream options that was never built by an advertising company and doesn't have $1 billion reason to profile you. It blocks trackers by default. It fights fingerprinting seriously instead of symbolically. And it just became, in the last few months specifically, the only realistic place left to get the internet's most effective privacy tools working at full strength. That browser is Firefox, built by Mozilla, a nonprofit whose founding mission is written directly into its own charter, keeping the internet open, accessible, and private, not maximizing advertising revenue. And in a moment, I'm about to walk you through something happened this year that made the gap between Firefox and everything else wider than it's ever been. Not a rumor, not a theory, an actual documented, dated shift in what Chrome allows you to protect yourself with, and what Firefox still does. Because as of this summer, Google didn't just weaken your ability to block ads and trackers on Chrome, they finished the job. And I want to walk you through exactly what changed, exactly when it changed, and exactly why it makes this a genuinely different conversation than it would have been even a year ago. Here's the update that should be a much bigger story than it currently is, and it's the specific reason this video needed to be made now rather than last year. For a couple of years, Google had been slowly rolling out something called Manifest v3, a rewrite of how Chrome extensions are allowed to function. On paper, Google framed it as a security and performance upgrade. In practice, it fundamentally gutted the capability of the most effective privacy tools that exist. The core change replaced an older, powerful API called WebRequest, which let extensions inspect and block network requests in real time, with a much more limited system called Declarative Net Request, which forces extensions to declare their filtering rules up front, capped at a fixed number, rather than reacting dynamically as you browse. That single technical change is the entire reason uBlock Origin, widely regarded as the single most effective ad and tracker blocker ever built, has been crippled on Chrome. And this year, Google finished what it started. Enterprise rollout of the full Manifest v2 shutdown began around June 2026, and by August, it extended to everyday users on Chrome version 140 and newer, meaning the full version of uBlock Origin was completely blocked from functioning on Chrome. What Chrome users are left with, instead, is something called uBlock Origin Lite, a stripped-down replacement limited to roughly 30,000 filtering rules, compared to the effectively unlimited, dynamically updating rule sets the full version has always used. Independent researchers estimate the full version of uBlock Origin saves users somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.8 billion a year in blocked ads, bandwidth, and malicious redirect protection combined. Chrome users, right now in the second half of 2026, no longer get access to that protection at full strength, and there's no setting you can flip to bring it back, because the capability itself was removed at the browser level. And it's not just an inconvenience. Cybersecurity researchers have specifically flagged ad blockers as a genuine defense layer against malvertising. Malicious ads that deliver spyware, ransomware, or drive-by malware disguised as legitimate content. Weakening that layer across the browser 3/4 of the internet uses isn't a small technical footnote. It's a meaningful downgrade in baseline security for thousands of the sites you probably visit weekly. Firefox took the opposite position, publicly and deliberately. Mozilla committed to continuing full support for both the old WebRequest API and the new Declarative Net Request system side by side, indefinitely, which means as of right now in 2026, the full, unrestricted, full-power version of uBlock Origin still runs completely intact on Firefox. No caps, no stripped-down light substitute, no compromise. Independent testing throughout this year has consistently confirmed Firefox as the mainstream browser where the strongest version of the internet's best ad and tracker blocker still functions the way it was originally designed to. Brave, notably, has managed to preserve a near-full uBlock Origin experience too by building its own blocking engine at the browser level rather than depending entirely on Chrome's extension rules. But because Brave is still Chromium-based under the hood, it remains exposed to whatever further restrictions Google decides to roll out next. Now let's talk about what Firefox actually does differently at the structural level, because the extension story is really just one symptom of a much bigger philosophical difference. Out of the box, with zero configuration, Firefox blocks third-party tracking cookies, the invisible tags that follow you silently from site to site, quietly assembling a profile of your interests for advertisers. On Chrome, those cookies work freely by default, unless you specifically go out of your way to disable them yourself. On Firefox, the protection is simply already active the moment you install it. Firefox also offers layered tracking protection, standard, strict, and custom, and in strict mode, it extends that blocking to cryptojacking scripts that quietly hijack your processor to mine cryptocurrency while you browse, plus known fingerprinting scripts specifically. Replicating that level of protection on Chrome would require stacking multiple third-party extensions manually, and even then, Chrome's own underlying architecture would still be quietly sending data back to Google, regardless of what you install on top of it. Then there's DNS over HTTPS, which matters more than most people realize. Every time you type a website address, your device sends a DNS request to translate that address into an actual server location. And by default, that request travels unencrypted, meaning your internet provider, your workplace network administrator, or anyone monitoring the connection can see exactly which sites you're visiting, even on pages using HTTPS. Firefox enabled encrypted DNS by default years, before Chrome bothered to catch up, meaning your browsing requests are protected from the very first step of the process, not somewhere further down the chain. Firefox also pioneered something called total cookie protection, a system that gives every single website its own isolated cookie jar, completely sealed off from every other site you visit. A tracking cookie planted by one advertising network on one website simply cannot follow you to the next one. Google has spent years talking about eventually phasing out third-party cookies through a project called Privacy Sandbox. But that initiative has drawn real, sustained scrutiny from regulators, including a formal investigation by the UK's Competition and Markets Authority over concerns that it's less about protecting users and more about consolidating Google's own advertising dominance while appearing to improve privacy on the surface. Firefox, by contrast, has no advertising ecosystem of its own to protect, which is exactly why its privacy features function as an actual technical wall rather than a negotiated compromise. So, we've covered what changed and why it changed this specific year. Next, I want to walk you through the fair, honest counterpoints, because I don't think a persuasive video is worth much if it skips the parts that complicate the story, including exactly how Firefox itself makes its money, and whether that creates a conflict of interest you should know about before you switch. Let's slow down here, because I think this is exactly the point where most videos telling you to just switch to Firefox quietly skip the uncomfortable part. And skipping it would make this whole video a lot less trustworthy. Here's the honest complication. Mozilla, the nonprofit behind Firefox, gets roughly 86% of its annual revenue from a single source, a search deal with Google, the same company Firefox's entire privacy pitch positions itself against. That deal makes Google the default search engine inside Firefox in most markets. And in exchange, Mozilla receives a substantial licensing payment every year. I want to say clearly, because fairness matters more to me than a clean narrative, this is a real documented tension. Mozilla's flagship privacy browser is financially dependent, in large part, on the company most associated with the exact surveillance advertising model Firefox markets itself as an alternative to. But here's why that tension doesn't actually undercut the core argument the way it might sound like it should. That revenue relationship is a search placement deal, not a data sharing arrangement. Mozilla doesn't sell your browsing history to Google, doesn't build advertising profiles from your activity, and doesn't have a shareholder base demanding quarterly ad revenue growth the way a publicly traded company does. You can verify this yourself. Mozilla publishes transparency reports and privacy documentation that's genuinely more detailed than what most commercial browser vendors disclose. The structural incentive is still meaningfully different, even with an imperfect funding source underneath it. It's worth knowing about. It's not, on its own, a reason to dismiss everything else in this video. Now, let's talk about the objection that comes up every single time someone suggests switching away from Chrome: speed. And I want to give you an honest, current answer instead of a dismissive one, because for years this objection was legitimately fair. Chrome earned its reputation for speed, but that gap has narrowed dramatically. Firefox's current engine, built on a ground-up rewrite Mozilla calls Quantum, brought its real-world performance into direct competition with Chrome across page loading and JavaScript execution. Where the difference actually shows up now isn't raw speed, it's memory behavior under load. Independent 2026 benchmarks, running both browsers side by side with dozens of tabs open consistently, show Firefox pulling ahead on memory efficiency the more tabs you add, while Chrome's memory footprint climbs sharply. One recent macOS benchmark using identical hardware found Chrome using less memory than Firefox at idle, and with a small handful of tabs. But at 50 tabs open, Chrome's usage ballooned to over 14 gigabytes compared to Firefox's roughly 8.8. If you've ever watched Chrome quietly eat through your entire RAM allocation with 15 or 20 tabs open, that's exactly the scenario where Firefox's architecture starts to genuinely matter, especially on older laptops where every available gigabyte counts. Mobile deserves its own honest mention too. On Android, Firefox is one of the only mobile browsers that supports full desktop-grade extensions, including the complete version of uBlock Origin, a real advantage most mobile browsers simply don't offer. Safari on iPhone, to Apple's credit, does provide genuinely solid intelligent tracking prevention. But it only protects you inside Apple's specific ecosystem, and it comes bundled with its own separate set of platform lock-in trade-offs. Firefox runs consistently across Windows, Mac, Linux, Android, and iOS, which means the same privacy protections travel with you regardless of which device you happen to be using that day. I also want to be fair about market position, because pretending Firefox is winning some kind of popularity contest would be dishonest. As of mid-2026, Firefox sits at roughly 3 to 4% of global browser share. According to the most recent StatCounter and Cloudflare radar data, a genuinely small slice compared to Chrome's roughly 2/3 dominance. That decline has been a long, multi-year trend, though the rate of decline has slowed meaningfully, from around 18% year-over-year losses in 2022 and 2023 down to roughly 13% more recently, with some month-to-month readings this year showing the number essentially flattening out. Mozilla also brought in new leadership at the CEO level at the end of 2025, signaling a real internal push to modernize the product rather than simply manage its decline. None of that makes Firefox the winning browser by market share. What it does mean is that the people still choosing it in 2026, specifically after watching Chrome dismantle its most effective privacy tools this year, are choosing it deliberately, not by default. So here's the honest, balanced picture heading into the practical part of this video. Firefox isn't perfect. It has a real funding tension worth knowing about, and it's a minority browser by any market measure. But on the two things that actually determine whether your daily browsing is being surveilled and monetized, tracking protection running by default, and whether the internet's most effective ad and privacy tools still function at full strength, Firefox is, right now in the second half of 2026, the clearest mainstream option left standing after Chrome's own extension changes this year. So if you're convinced, or even just curious enough to test it yourself, here's exactly how to actually make the switch properly in about 10 minutes without losing a single bookmark or saved password in the process. Let's make this practical, because a video that just tells you Chrome is bad without giving you an actual path forward isn't much use to you at 11 at night when you're trying to decide whether this is worth the effort. Here's exactly what switching looks like, start to finish, and it genuinely takes about 10 minutes. Download Firefox directly from Mozilla's official site. On first launch, it will offer to import everything from your current browser automatically. Bookmarks, saved passwords, browsing history, even open tabs in some versions. You don't need to manually rebuild anything. The import process is smoother than most people expect, and within a few days of normal use, it stops feeling like a new tool and just starts feeling like your browser. Once it's installed, go into Settings, then Privacy and Security, and switch Enhanced Tracking Protection from Standard to Strict. That single toggle extends your default protection to cryptojacking scripts and known fingerprinting attempts, on top of the tracking cookie blocking that's already active out of the box. Next, install uBlock Origin from Firefox's official add-on store. And remember, this is the full, unrestricted version, the one that no longer functions at full strength on Chrome as of this year's Manifest v3 enforcement. Finally, confirm DNS over HTTPS is enabled in your network settings, which it typically is by default already, encrypting your DNS lookups from the very first step of every page load. That's the entire setup. 10 minutes, 3 settings, and you're running a meaningfully more private browser than anything Chrome or Edge currently offer, without giving up your bookmarks, your saved logins, or the sites you actually use every day. Now, I want to leave you with the bigger picture here, because I think it's easy to treat this as a purely personal, purely technical decision, and I don't think that's the full story. Every time you use a browser built by a company whose core revenue depends on knowing more about you, you're not just making a convenience choice. You're feeding a system that treats your attention, your habits, and your data as the actual product being sold. And the more people who quietly accept that as simply how the internet works, the harder it becomes for anything to genuinely change. When you switch to something built on a different incentive structure, you're not just protecting your own browsing. You're supporting one of the only organizations left actively building toward a version of the internet that isn't primarily optimized around extracting value from your attention. Here's a question worth sitting with, honestly, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. When's the last time you actually checked what your current browser is sending back to its own company instead of just trusting the name on the app icon? If your honest answer is never, you're not alone. That's true for the overwhelming majority of people using Chrome or Edge right now, and it's exactly the gap this whole video was built to close. I also want to be upfront about something before you go make this decision, because intellectual honesty matters more here than getting easy applause in the comments. No browser, including Firefox, can promise you zero data collection or perfect anonymity. That's simply not how the modern web works, and anyone claiming otherwise is overselling you. What I can tell you, based on everything walked through in this video, is that Firefox is currently the mainstream browser where tracking protection is on by default, rather than buried in settings, where the internet's most effective ad and privacy tools still run at full strength after this year's Chrome changes, and where the company building it doesn't have a multi-billion-dollar advertising business, depending on knowing more about you every year. That's not a perfect guarantee. It's a meaningfully different starting point than what Chrome or Edge currently offer you by default. The internet wasn't originally built to be a surveillance network. It was built as a tool for communication, creativity, and connection. Somewhere along the way, for a huge share of what most people use it for daily, it quietly became both at once. The browser sitting on your screen right now is either actively part of that surveillance layer, or it's one of the few remaining tools actively working against it. And as of this year, that distinction is more measurable, more documented, and more consequential than it's ever been. So here's my actual ask, more specific than just go download something. Try the 10-minute switch this week. Import your bookmarks, flip enhanced tracking. Protection to strict, install the full version of uBlock Origin while it still runs at full strength somewhere. Give it 7 days of real, normal use before deciding whether it's for you. And when you do, come back and tell me in the comments what you actually noticed. fewer ads, better battery life, memory usage, anything. This only becomes a useful comparison when more people are running it on their own machines, instead of taking one video's word for it. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, subscribe, because I'm already working on the next one. A full walkthrough of exactly what data Google's Privacy Sandbox actually collects behind the scenes, and whether it holds up to the promises being made about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.